On a crisp spring morning in New York City, 74-year-old Ellie Wallace shuffled through bustling streets. The air carried a sharp chill, unusual for April, and Ellie clutched her frayed beige cardigan closer to her frail frame. Arthritis had long since turned the uneven pavement into a daily challenge, but she faced each step with practiced determination. The city teemed with life, hurrying suits, distracted shoppers, and buzzing cabs. For most, it was an ordinary weekday, but for Ellie, this walk was a rare venture outside her modest apartment. She had been prescribed new medication for her adrenal condition, and the nearby pharmacy had just restocked it. After picking up the pills, her stomach growled, prompting her to seek a moment of warmth and comfort. Rounding a corner, Ellie spotted a sleek new café tucked beneath a modern office tower. Its minimalist design glinted in the morning sun, and the floral arrangements framing the doorway seemed inviting. A grand opening banner swayed gently in the breeze. Ellie hesitated, clutching her fabric shopping bag, before deciding that a cup of tea and a warm seat would be just the reprieve she needed. Inside, the café exuded sophistication, gleaming tables, soft lighting, and the faint scent of artisanal coffee. The hum of conversation floated through the air, dominated by sharp-dressed professionals tapping at laptops or gesturing over business charts. Ellie carefully navigated the room and settled into a corner booth, her eyes scanning the modern decor as she tucked her bag beside her. A young server with a cheery demeanor approached her table. "Good morning. What can I get started for you today?" Ellie smiled warmly. "Just some hot water, please. And maybe a slice of something light. Do you have lemon tarts?" "We do." "I'll bring one right over," the server replied, jotting the order with enthusiasm. Ellie added softly, "And could I trouble you for an extra warm towel? My hands, well, they're a bit stiff from the cold." "Of course, ma'am," the server replied without hesitation. As the waitress left, Ellie sighed contentedly. She reached into her bag to retrieve her new pill bottle, setting it beside a compact mirror. Her medical routine, though tedious, had become second nature. Glancing at her watch, 12:45 p.m., Ellie smiled faintly. She'd have her tea, take her medication, and head home before the skies turned gray. The café seemed a haven, a bubble of calm in the chaotic city. But Ellie's moment of solace was soon interrupted by the sharp voice of a man. "Excuse me. Are you lost?" Ellie looked up to find a tall, sharply dressed man with a rigid posture. His name tag glinted under the pendant lights, Gregory Alden, manager. His steely eyes raked over her mismatched attire with barely disguised disdain. "No," Ellie replied softly. "I was just waiting for my tea." Gregory's lips curled into a tight, cold smile. "This café has a specific ambience, and we aim to maintain it. If you don't intend to order more or linger." Ellie blinked, confused. "I'm a paying customer, sir. Your server was very kind." She didn't realize, Gregory cut her off, his voice louder now. "This isn't a place for loitering." Ellie's cheeks burned. "Loitering? I'm just..." Her words faltered as Gregory leaned closer. "People come here for business, for atmosphere. You don't belong here. Do us a favor and take your tea somewhere else." Ellie's breath caught as murmurs rippled through the café. Faces turned away, feigning ignorance, yet their discomfort was palpable. She looked around, but no one met her eyes. The humiliation felt like a physical blow. Suddenly, the young waitress returned, carrying Ellie's tea and tart. "Sorry for the wait, ma'am," she chirped, oblivious to the tension. Before Ellie could reach for the plate, Gregory snatched the tray. With a flick of his wrist, the tea spilled, scalding Ellie's hand, and the tart landed with a splatter on the table. Gasps echoed as Gregory sneered, "Oops. Clumsy me." Ellie recoiled, clutching her burned hand, her voice trembling. Why are you doing this?" Gregory straightened, his smirk unrelenting. "You've overstayed your welcome. Leave, or I'll call security. The young waitress stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror. The cafe fell silent, save for Ellie's shaky breaths. As she fumbled to gather her belongings, her medication bottle tipped, spilling its precious contents onto the floor. Ellie bent to retrieve them, tears blurring her vision, when a rich, steady voice rang out. That's enough. The room turned to see a man with a familiar silhouette stepping forward. His dark hair and piercing gaze silenced the murmurs instantly. Johnny Depp had been sitting near the back, unnoticed until now. All eyes fixed on him as he crossed the cafe, his expression a mix of calm and quiet fury. Is this how you treat your patrons? Johnny asked Gregory, his tone cold as ice. Gregory stammered, Mr. Depp, I didn't realize. Save it, Johnny snapped, kneeling to help Ellie retrieve her pills. This is shameful. Apologize to her. Ellie's heart pounded as Johnny's warm hand steadied hers. The contrast between his kindness and Gregory's malice brought fresh tears to her eyes. As Johnny stood, Gregory floundered, Sir, I can explain. No explanation will undo what you've done, Johnny cut him off. But you'll answer for it. The tension in the cafe was electric. Phones emerged as patrons began filming. The first ripple of justice had begun. The room remained still as Johnny Depp's gaze bore into Gregory. The patrons, once indifferent, now whispered among themselves. Ellie stood trembling, her burned hand cradled close to her chest as Johnny turned to her. Ma'am, are you all right? His voice was gentle now, a stark contrast to the tension moments before. Ellie managed a small nod, though her voice cracked. I think so. Johnny gestured to the young waitress still frozen nearby. Please get some ice for her hand, he said firmly but kindly. The waitress scurried off without hesitation. Gregory, desperate to regain control, adjusted his tie. Mr. Depp, I assure you this is a misunderstanding. Stop, Johnny interrupted sharply. I don't need your excuses. He turned to address the cafe at large, his voice loud enough to carry. Did anyone here think it was acceptable to treat this woman like this? A heavy silence fell. A few patrons looked sheepishly at their coffee cups, avoiding eye contact. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No. Johnny continued, his tone biting. Then why did no one speak up? The question hung in the air, an unspoken indictment of the room. The waitress returned, handing Ellie a cloth-wrapped ice pack with a murmured, Here you go, ma'am. Ellie accepted it gratefully, wincing as the cool relief met her burned skin. Thank you, she whispered. Gregory's bravado faltered as Johnny turned back to him. This cafe isn't about ambience or exclusivity, Johnny said. It's a public space, where everyone deserves respect. What you did wasn't just cruel, it was a disgrace. Mr. Depp, Gregory stammered, his voice rising defensively, you're misunderstanding the situation. She wasn't following our policies. Policies? Johnny's eyebrow arched. Is it policy to humiliate elderly customers? To waste their food? To burn them? Gregory's face turned crimson as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Listen, Johnny continued, his tone softening slightly, we all have bad days. But there's no excuse for this. You owe her an apology. Gregory's jaw tightened, his pride warring with the pressure of dozens of phone cameras pointed his way. Finally, he mumbled, I'm sorry. Ellie looked up, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. No, you're not. You're sorry you got caught. The cafe erupted in murmured agreement, punctuated by scattered applause. Ellie's words carried a quiet dignity that no one could ignore. Johnny smiled faintly, impressed by her strength. Well said. With that, he turned to Ellie. Let me help you, he said. Can you walk? Yes, she replied hesitantly, but my medication. Johnny knelt again, gathering the scattered pills. He examined the soaked bottle and frowned. How important are these? They're my lifeline, Ellie admitted. I can't go without them. Johnny's expression hardened. Then we'll replace them immediately. Taking Ellie's bag, Johnny guided her toward the door. Gregory watched them leave, his expression a mixture of frustration and humiliation. The patrons began clapping as Johnny and Ellie exited, a spontaneous show of support that echoed loudly in the sleek café. Outside in the rain. The sky had turned gray, and light raindrops pattered against the pavement as Johnny escorted Ellie to a bench under a nearby awning. He placed her bag beside her and knelt to meet her gaze. First things first, he said, pulling out his phone. Let's replace those pills. Is there a pharmacy nearby? Ellie nodded, her voice small. Just a few blocks down. Johnny smiled. Good. We'll get you what you need. As he tapped on his phone, a small crowd began to gather outside the café. People whispered and pointed, phones once again raised to capture the scene. Johnny ignored the attention, focused entirely on Ellie. A woman in her 30s approached cautiously, holding out an umbrella. Here, she said shyly. For the rain. Johnny accepted it with a nod of thanks, holding it over Ellie. Thank you, Ellie said softly to the stranger. The woman smiled. No one deserves what happened in there. Johnny glanced at her. Thank you for saying that. Too many stayed silent. The woman nodded, her cheeks flushing. I should have spoken up sooner. As the woman moved away, Johnny turned back to Ellie. The pharmacy's still open. Are you ready? Ellie nodded, gripping her bag tightly. Johnny offered his hand, and together they began walking, the umbrella shielding them from the drizzle. The crowd parted as they passed, some murmuring words of encouragement to Ellie as they went. At the pharmacy. The fluorescent lights of the small pharmacy cast a stark contrast to the dreary street outside. Ellie waited in a chair by the counter while Johnny handled the transaction, speaking quietly with the pharmacist. The man behind the counter hesitated, his eyes darting between Johnny and the prescription bottle. This medication isn't cheap, he said. Johnny pulled out a sleek black credit card, his tone firm. That won't be a problem. Fill it, please. The pharmacist nodded quickly, disappearing into the back. Ellie watched the interaction with wide eyes. Mr. Depp, I can't let you pay for that. It's too much. Johnny turned to her, his expression kind but resolute. Eleanor, after what you've been through, it's the least I can do. Her lips trembled as tears welled in her eyes. You've already done so much. Johnny knelt beside her chair, placing a hand gently on hers. It's not about the money. It's about showing that people care. You deserve kindness, Ellie. Everyone does. Ellie nodded, unable to speak. Minutes later, the pharmacist returned with a new bottle, handing it to Johnny with a quiet, "Here you go, sir." Johnny took it and thanked him before turning back to Ellie. Let's get you home. The rain had lightened to a mist as Johnny Depp helped Ellie into a cab. She clutched the replacement pill bottle tightly, her thoughts muddled by exhaustion and disbelief at the events of the day. Where to? Asked the driver, glancing at them through the rearview mirror. Ellie hesitated. I live on 8th Avenue. As the cab rolled through the damp streets, Ellie looked down at the pill bottle. Thank you, Mr. Depp, she said softly. For everything. Johnny smiled kindly. It's the least I could do after what you endured. No one should be treated that way. When the cab stopped in front of a modest brick building, Johnny paid the fare and helped Ellie out. Would you like to come up for tea? She asked tentatively. I'd love to, he replied. Inside the apartment. Ellie's small apartment was neat and cozy, decorated with faded floral curtains and photographs from her younger days. As she bustled in the kitchen to prepare tea, Johnny admired the worn piano in the corner. Do you play? he asked when she returned with 2 steaming mugs. I used to, she said wistfully. Arthritis makes it harder these days. They sipped their tea in a companionable silence before Johnny spoke. Ellie, I'd like to help more if I can. She frowned slightly. You've already done more than enough. It's not charity, Johnny said gently. It's a way to make things a little easier for you. After a moment of hesitation, Ellie nodded. I suppose I could use some support, but I'd like to repay you. Johnny chuckled. Deal. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. Ellie opened the door to find her neighbor Marcus holding his phone. Ellie, have you seen this? He exclaimed, showing her a viral video of the café incident. You're all over social media. Ellie's eyes widened. What? Marcus grinned. People are calling for that manager to be fired. You've got the whole city behind you. Johnny, standing behind Ellie, placed a calming hand on her shoulder. Sometimes, these things spark change, he said. Ellie looked overwhelmed. I never wanted all this attention. I know, Johnny said. But it could be an opportunity to share your story and help others. Ellie nodded slowly. Maybe. Let me think about it. The next morning, Ellie awoke to her phone buzzing non-stop. Marcus's voice greeted her the moment she picked up. Ellie. Turn on the news. She switched on her small TV to see a reporter standing outside the now-closed café. Protesters held signs reading, Justice for Ellie, and End Discrimination. The reporter said, the viral video of actor Johnny Depp intervening on behalf of an elderly woman has sparked national conversations about respect and fairness in public spaces. The café manager has been placed on leave pending investigation. Ellie's stomach churned at the sight of her face on the screen. A knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Johnny standing there, holding coffee cups. Morning, he said with a smile. May I come in? She led him to the sofa, gesturing to the TV. I didn't expect this. Johnny nodded. It's a lot, I know. But this attention could make a real difference. Ellie frowned. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this kind of spotlight. Johnny sat beside her, his tone gentle. Sometimes, we're chosen for these moments. There's power in your story, Ellie. It could inspire others to stand up for themselves and each other. After a long pause, she asked, what do you think I should do? I've been contacted by a morning talk show, Johnny said. They want us to discuss what happened. It's your choice, but I'll be by your side if you decide to do it. Ellie sighed. If it might help others. I'll do it. Johnny smiled warmly. That's brave of you. 2 days later, Ellie found herself in a brightly lit studio, seated beside Johnny Depp. The set was bustling with cameras, lights, and producers adjusting microphones. The talk show host welcomed them with a warm smile as the countdown began. Good morning, everyone, the host began, turning to Ellie. Ms. Wallace, your story has touched hearts across the nation. Can you tell us what happened that day? Ellie glanced at Johnny, who nodded reassuringly. She took a deep breath and recounted the events, her voice steady but emotional. I went in for a simple cup of tea, but I left feeling humiliated and hurt. If it weren't for Mr. Depp, I don't know how I would have managed. The host turned to Johnny. What made you step in? Johnny leaned forward. I believe everyone deserves kindness and respect. Watching Ellie face such treatment, it was unacceptable. I couldn't stand by and do nothing. The audience applauded, and the host smiled. Your actions sparked a movement. The cafe has issued a public apology, and the manager is facing consequences. Ellie, how does it feel knowing your story has created change? Ellie hesitated before answering. I didn't want attention, but if it means fewer people go through what I did, then it's worth it. I'm grateful to Johnny for standing up for me and for all the people who've shown support. The interview ended with a standing ovation, and as Ellie and Johnny left the set, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. A quiet resolution. Back at her apartment, Ellie sat with Johnny one last time. "You've changed my life," she said. "You've inspired me, Ellie," Johnny replied. "Your strength reminds us all of what really matters." He handed her an envelope. "This is for anything you might need, your medication, home repairs, or even a small vacation." Ellie opened it to find a generous check. Her eyes filled with tears. "I can't accept this." Johnny smiled. "It's not charity, it's thanks for being a symbol of resilience." As he rose to leave, Ellie stood, her heart full. "You're a rare soul, Mr. Depp." "Thank you." He tipped an imaginary hat and grinned. "Take care, Ellie." As Johnny's car disappeared down the street, Ellie looked at the check in her hand, knowing it represented more than money, it was hope, a new beginning. Her story, once rooted in pain, had transformed into a beacon of strength and kindness. She smiled, ready to embrace whatever came next.